What up, students? Wanted to be more relatable to you dogs, so I got this pretty sweet straight billed hat and stuff, and I'm wearing it sideways, like the cool kids. And just like the cool kids, I want to talk about Vietnam. Okay, so I can't do this. We've talked about the Vietnam War so far, kind of how we got involved in it, why we were there to stop the spread of communism, and if you remember the domino theory, right? That if South Vietnam becomes communist, the rest of Southeast Asia will become communist too. Um, and so we get involved in Vietnam. Kennedy really starts it, but Lyndon Johnson, with the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, really turns it into a full-scale war. And if you remember, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was when Congress gave up their power to declare war, and basically turned the war over to Lyndon Johnson and said, "Here, do what you want." And I said, down the road, they're going to regret that decision and they're going to go back on it. And we'll talk about that in our final, partial week of class next week. So remember that fighting in Vietnam is very different than fighting in World War I or World War II, and that you have what are called search and destroy missions. And so American troops are going out in small packs and they're hunting the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, and the Viet Cong. Remember, we don't really even know who our enemy is a lot of the time because the Viet Cong are guerrilla fighters. They don't wear uniforms. They look just like the next door neighbor, right? And they attack you and then they run back into the jungle and they go home and go to bed at night. We're fighting the Vietnamese war by air as well. There was a thing called Operation Rolling Thunder where we bombed North Vietnam to try to bomb them into submission and destroy their factories and military targets. And that didn't work. And if you're really interested, I wrote a 30-page research paper on that, and I'm sure you'll love to read it. And also we use things like Agent Orange, right? Agent Orange, the planes would fly over the jungle and they'd spray Agent Orange down on the jungle. The leaves would fall off, and years later that created these horrible health effects for American soldiers that are still today suffering from cancer, different heart-related issues, neurological issues, as well as birth defects in the children that they had. Okay, so now we're up to the turning point. This war really is a full-scale war because Tonkin Gulf was 1964, right? We're into 1968 now. Lyndon Johnson has been president for a little over 4 years, and 1968 is a re-election year. And we're into January, okay? So we're into the primary season, right? When people are deciding that they're going to run for president and they're campaigning. And our Christmas, our Easter, right? They're our biggest holidays. Well, if you're Vietnamese, you're not a Christian. So for the most part, there are some, right? There are some Catholics and some Christians or Protestants. But for the most part, you're probably Buddhist, right? So those mean nothing to you. Their big holiday is the New Year. And in Vietnam, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year is called Tet, T-E-T. And in the past, kind of like in World War I, we talked about the Christmas truce where the Germans and the British met in no man's land and they exchanged presents and there was a ceasefire for a day. In the past, in Vietnam, there has been kind of an unspoken ceasefire during the Vietnamese. What are you doing? You look like a pig. During the Vietnamese New Year, during Tet, and we expected that this year. My uncle Bob Moyer, my mom's brother, was in Vietnam. He was in the Navy, and when Tet happened, he went to bed, and he was sleeping, and he heard these explosions outside his dorm that he was staying in, and he thought they were fireworks from people celebrating the New Year, and he continued to sleep. Little did he know his base was under attack. Okay, so what happens? January 30th. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong staged this huge attack on American bases in South Vietnamese cities, and their goal is to overrun the bases, to overrun the cities, and force the South Vietnamese into surrender. And it is a horrible failure for them in that sense. They don't take one American military base. They don't capture one city. We kill 40,000 of their soldiers. They kill 1,100 Americans and about 2,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. From a military standpoint, we destroy them, right? Looks like this is a huge victory for the United States. It ends up being a disaster, okay, politically, because Lyndon Johnson had been telling the American public that up to this point, we are winning the war. Remember how we determine whether we're winning or losing in Vietnam? We count the number of dead enemy soldiers, and we said there's two problems with this. One is that we don't know if the dead guy laying on the ground is just a South Vietnamese farmer who's going about his daily business, or if it's a Viet Cong soldier. And two, those body count numbers are inflated to make the commanding officers look better, to make the war look like it's going better to the media, all of these things. So Lyndon Johnson has been selling the war as we are winning and we almost have them broken. Well, if the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong can stage a multi-week, I mean literally over a month, sustained secret attack, that shows the American public that this thing is not almost done, and they are going to continue fighting. And we've been in this already for 4 official kind of years, but really longer. How long are we going to wait this out? And Americans don't last very long with war, right? You have to win that thing pretty quickly or it's over. I don't know what this thing is on my eye. Really bothering me, though. So anyway, after the Tet Offensive is over, from a military standpoint, we win. But a journalist, today everybody turns to different news networks. Some people watch MSNBC, some watch Fox, some watch NBC, ABC, CBS, HLN, CNBC. What are some other net? I can't even, that's just 7 right off the top of my head that you can turn to get your news. Back in 1968, most people were watching a guy on CBS News called Walter Cronkite. He was called the most trusted man in America, and he was in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive. And he comes home, and he got on TV, and he did something that news reporters back then never did. He gave his opinion. Now, if you watch our stupid news networks today, that's all they do is give their opinions, right? I'm doing something here. All they do is give their opinions, right? Cronkite came home, and he said, "It is my opinion that the war in Vietnam is unwinnable for the United States." And Americans start to turn against the war effort in droves, right? Lyndon Johnson realizes, and if you get a chance to look at the PowerPoint, look at the PowerPoint that I put online. You're going to need to complete your quiz at the end anyway. Listen. If you get a chance to watch the PowerPoint that I put online, or you have to, look how much being president for 4 years aged Lyndon Johnson. Look at his before and after picture, right? So Lyndon Johnson gets challenged from within his own party. That would be like another Republican running against Donald Trump this year. Guy by the name of Eugene McCarthy. He's a senator from the state of Minnesota. He's not real popular. He's hugely anti-war, but he does challenge Lyndon Johnson. And eventually, President Kennedy's brother, Bobby Kennedy, is going to jump into the race too. And Lyndon Johnson realizes there's a really good chance he's not going to get reelected. And I think ultimately the war just wore him down. And Johnson did something that most presidents do not do. He stepped down after officially Johnson was almost 6 years because he served out a little bit of Kennedy's term too, right? And he said, "I just don't want to do this anymore. I'm not going to run again. I'm dropping out." That's what Joe Biden claims he's going to do if he wins the election in November. He says, "I'll only be a 4-year president. I'm not going to serve for longer than 4 years." We'll see. Anyway, Johnson drops out, and when he drops out, his vice president, a little guy by the name of Hubert Humphrey, says, "Well, if Lyndon Johnson's not running, I'll run." So you have kind of a 3-person race. You have Bobby Kennedy, you have Eugene McCarthy, this anti-war senator from Minnesota, and you have Hubert Humphrey, and something's going to happen. Bobby Kennedy is giving a speech at, it's called the Ambassador Hotel in California. just won the California primary. Huge win for him. Looks like he's on his way to win the Democratic nomination for president. He leaves the podium after giving his victory speech, and he makes a wrong turn. Not really. He takes a shortcut through the kitchen of the hotel. And when he does, there is an assassin, a guy by the name of Sirhan, first name, Sirhan, last name, comes up to him and shoots Bobby Kennedy and kills him. And so just like his brother, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. And Hubert Humphrey goes on to win the Democratic nomination. And he's going to run against our old friend that we talked about already, Richard Nixon. Now, it's actually a fairly close campaign.
He broke into the Watergate.
Yeah, he did. We haven't gotten there yet. Don't ruin my punchline. This is what happens when you're kids of two history teachers. You know weird stuff that most third graders don't know. Anyway, Nixon wins, right? And Nixon wins on a promise to bring back law and order. And in the convention, the Democratic convention that was held in Chicago in 1968, riots break out, and Nixon says, we won't have this when I'm president. I'm going to fix this. Not only that, I have a secret plan. Now, I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I have a secret plan to win the Vietnam War. That gets Richard Nixon elected president. Okay? Right after he becomes president, he does two things. He's going to start a program he calls Vietnamization. It's kind of like what we're doing in Afghanistan right now. The Vietnamization means you're going to slowly turn the fighting over to the Vietnamese people and start withdrawing American troops. That's our goal in Afghanistan right now. So he is going to start to scale down the war. But as he does that, he wants the North Vietnamese to know that we still mean business, and we plan on keeping South Vietnam non-communist, because Nixon, again, kind of buys into the domino theory as well, that if you let South Vietnam fall to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia will. And if that happens in his first 4 years, there's no way he's getting reelected as president. And so while he starts to withdraw troops and turn the fighting over, at the same time, he expands the war into the neighboring country of Cambodia. Now, here's why. If I'm North Vietnam, or I'm the Viet Cong, and I know that the Americans will destroy my supplies in South Vietnam, where will I hide them? Well, if I walk over the imaginary line, this isn't like a walled-off border between Mexico and the United States. It's like walking through the woods, and one step you're in Vietnam, and one step you're in Cambodia. They go over into Cambodia, they go 20, 30 miles in, and that's where they keep everything because they know we won't touch them, right? And Nixon says, let's go after it. And so he goes after not only their supplies there, but also starts bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. And this is hugely unpopular on college campuses. And the biggest thing you see in Kent State is a university in Ohio. There's a multi-day protest, and it eventually starts to turn violent. The students light the ROTC building on fire, and this is where students that are in college, like Josh Dasher is in the ROTC, that are planning on going to the military afterwards, get training to become out and become an officer when they get out of school in the military. And that building got set on fire and burned to the ground. The protesters started throwing rocks, and the National Guard is brought in to keep peace and order. Depending on who you talk to, the events have different stories. The National Guard soldiers, of course, are armed. The students, for the most part, are not, but they are violent, and they're doing things that are dangerous. But the National Guard claimed that there was a sniper that fired shots at them. And so they opened up fire, opened back up on the crowd. Students, of course, claimed there was no such thing. Anyway, in the end, 4 students were killed at Kent State, Ohio. And shortly after that, 2 more were killed at the university in Mississippi. And so you have these huge protests breaking out all over the United States on college campuses. Nixon is up for re-election pretty soon. But there's also a group, although you see a lot of protests, I'm trying to wrap this up here in the next minute and a half because I don't like to go much over 15 minutes if I can help it. There's a group that's your parents' age, it's my age, it's your grandparents' age, called the silent majority still in the United States. And this silent... You're going to knock my computer off the coffee table. Stop messing around. There's a group called the silent majority. They're your parents, your grandparents, the people who aren't outspoken, right? They have their opinions, but they keep quiet about them. This is before Facebook. Now, oddly enough, there's a lot of grandparents that are getting really involved in politics on Facebook, but that's besides the point. Normally, grandparents, people your age, kept quiet. And so the silent majority actually carries Nixon along. Even though the loud protesters are the ones getting all attention, not necessarily everybody is a loud protester. Some of them, the majority of people, want an end to the Vietnam War, but they want to make sure we do it the right way and we don't just quit. Okay. Something else happens in 1971 that turns people against their government, something called the Pentagon Papers. And these were documents that were released to the New York Times, and they ran full-page stories on this that proved that the government of the United States lied to its people. That you don't have pants on. I'm filming something for school and you don't have pants on. This place is a madhouse. It proved a number of things. One, it proved to the American people that we were involved in Vietnam way before Lyndon Johnson, right? That Kennedy had people there, that even Eisenhower had people there. And even though we told the American people that we're just getting involved in Vietnam in the early 60s, we had been there a lot longer. Two, it showed that the U.S. government knew that the people of South Vietnam did not support their government. She's crying now because I yelled at her for not having pants on. Anyway, go check on your sister, please. It proved to the people that the government of South Vietnam did not have the support of its people. And that we were keeping them propped up. It proved that the United States had knowingly been lying to the American people about the body count method. And it turns many, many, many people against the war. And so that's kind of what we're going to end with right now. Next week, we do a really quick wrap-up. Next week starts the 18th. I'm going to give you probably one little assignment to wrap up the Vietnam War. That's going to be our last week of school. I do want to get Vietnam completed and show you kind of how it ends and how we get out of there and the long-term impacts. My house is turning into chaos. My wife's yelling at me from the basement, and I have a kid crying in the background. I think we'll finish it with that now. Hope your quarantine's going as good as mine. See you later.